was recently in a campus student center. I was heading across it to go to a conference room where I was going to be telling stories. And this student center was alive. It was buzzing. There was music coming out of the speakers, up and all around the ceiling and different parts of the walls. There were students all over, different pieces of furniture, studying, some on different devices. Back here, there were different places where you could get things to eat, so a number of the tables had food next to the books. And as I was dashing off to my work, I looked over and noticed a table where there were two students sitting. And on this side, one of them was deep in the telling of a story. And this student was the kind that talks a lot with their hands, you know, this type of storyteller, talker. And it was here, and it was here, and it was here, all the way through. On the other side of that table, the person experiencing the story was so wrapped in what was happening that they were leaning halfway across the table. And the face had dropped a little bit, and their eyes had that glazy look as if they were actually looking beyond the storyteller. And they were so deep into this experience that an entire forkful of salad was not being eaten. It was something kind of like this. And it was just the most delicious example of really good storytelling. I spent a lot of time thinking about storytelling. And I don't mean storytelling combined with some other art form, as is often thought about nowadays. I mean pure storytelling, when a person tells a story to someone else, and that experience that happens within. This is something that we call orature. And while that term is relatively new in its coinage, it is actually a really, really old concept. It goes back as far as we've been telling stories to each other. It is far older than its relative, literature, which is printed narrative. And even though we talk about literature all the time, especially in academic settings, we rarely talk about orature with the same seriousness or with a set of codified terms and concepts, unless you're really in the world of professional storytelling. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. When we tell stories, we really have three types of conveyance that's happening. One of those is the physical. When we tell a story, we're actually using our body quite a bit to tell stories. Some people gesticulate way out here, and maybe you have an uncle or a mama who talks like this, and these are the people at your family gatherings that you love to be around because they have big stories and they command big audiences. But some people just use their core when they tell stories, and some reserve just subtle facial changes to express the physicality of their stories. The second conveyance is the aural and the oral. These are the sounds we make when we tell stories. And I think that most people would think that storytelling is mainly just saying words. And while that's the majority of narrative, the narrative that we're sharing, there's actually so much more to it than that, even within the sounds we make. I like to think of it as something like when you have a really great musical experience, it's far more than just the notes that are printed on the page. A really great storytelling experience is far more than just the words that we're speaking. There are actually all kinds of other sounds that we make when we're telling stories to people. So I want to demonstrate just a little bit, and I'm going to go into the realm of traditional story from right around here in Appalachia. Boom. 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 The giant boomed through the forest, knocking down trees in its way, looking for that one. Where is the one who stole my goose that lays golden eggs? Under this boulder. The giant picked up the boulder and heaved it across the treetops. It landed just on the edge of the town on the other side of the forest. This type of demonstration here is trying to show you a little bit of the physical as it combines with the sounds that we make that are far more than just words. Hopefully you noticed that I was doing a lot more than just saying words there. Well, the third conveyance is something that we don't talk about a whole lot, and maybe don't even think about a lot, and that is an exchange of energy that happens when we tell stories. Now, depending on your personal beliefs or bent, whatever it happens to be, you might call this aura, you might call it spirit. There's lots of different ways we could call this, but what happens is there's actually a metaphysical exchange of energy that connects the person telling the story to the person receiving it. It's exactly what I was describing in that earlier scenario where the two students were at the table in the student center. They had that bond. Now, these three conveyances will help us understand a very simple illustration that explains what happens when storytelling is happening. And right here, I'm going to bring in an image that comes from Doug Lippman. Doug is a storyteller and a story theorist, and he brought to us the idea of the storytelling triangle. I like to think of it as the Orature triangle. So just imagine a triangle right here. Over here at this angle is where the storyteller is. And then up here at this angle is where the story is. If this is a traditional story, then it's kept alive in the minds of all the people in that particular community. If it is a personal story, it's kept alive in your own memory. And there's lots of range between those two. But here's the story, here's the storyteller, and they should be connected on this side of the triangle. If they're not, then there's no reason for this person to be telling the story because they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, let's go to the bottom, to the base of this triangle. Here we have the storyteller. Over here we have what in olden times we might have called the listener. But I'm going to replace that term with one that comes from Elizabeth Ellis. Elizabeth Ellis is a storyteller and story teacher, and she introduced to us the idea of the story-er. When you're engaging in storytelling, the verb for what you're doing is storying. It's a more inclusive term here than listener, because although if you can hear when you're experiencing story, you are listening, you don't have to be able to hear to experience story. If you can, you're doing that, but you're also watching a story happen. And as that's happening, you're also starting to visualize in your mind's eye. You're starting to internalize what's happening in the story, and then you start to overlay onto that your own personal memories and experiences. Maybe you haven't been in that situation that the storyteller's telling you about, but you've had similar experiences, or you know people that have. And as you do that, you're starting to connect this side of the triangle, the story to the story. So for example, a few minutes ago, I told you a story about a student center, and even though I didn't go into great detail about it, I bet most of you started thinking about your student center here. I didn't go into detail about the sexes of the people at the table, but you probably started to fill those out. And I didn't talk about what kind of salad it was, but maybe you saw kale or tomatoes at the end of that fork. I don't know, it just depends on how deeply you got into that little story that I was telling. Well, as those parts of the triangle start to come together, we have storytelling. Well, what's the point? What does this matter to you? When all those connections are made, there is a subconscious understanding of trust, of value, where the storier says, I trust what you're sharing with me, and I value the story you have to share, even if I didn't experience it, even if I'm from a different group of people than you are, even if I have a different belief system. When that metaphysical connection happens, that says, I trust you and I value you. We're at a juncture where there are incredible forces happening right now trying to prevent the nourishment of understanding and empathy. But storytelling builds those things. So if you want to have better friendships, if you want to have stronger relationships, if you want to invest in the social fabric because you believe in it, then I encourage you to become a better storyteller. Take time to become a better storier. Because when those connections are made, in the world of storytelling, we'd probably call it magic. But in waking life, we call that community. And the other thing that happens is we are saying to every generation that came before us that we would take a needle and a thread and stitch ourselves back to it to accept that tradition that they've passed along to us, the value of community, and that we're taking energy and time to invest in it, to hand it forward to those who will call us ancestors. This is the power of storytelling and the responsibility of storytelling being.